G'day everyone. My phone alarm's gone off just as we've started the live webinar there. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name's Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our webinar series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, which is the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute's podcast, Follow the Money, where we explain big economic issues in plain English. And of course, if you're just tuning into the Australia Institute for the first time, we are an independent think tank based in Canberra, and we're only independent because our amazing community supports us to do our work. And if you want to support us to continue to do work with impact and influence, please consider supporting us with a small tax-deductible gift today. You can do that at australiainstitute.org.au. So just a bit of housekeeping for today. A reminder on Zoom that you can type in questions for our panelists using the Q&A box, and you should be able to upvote other people's questions as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll remove you from the chat. And finally, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it will go up on our website later today, as well as on australiainstitute.tv. So in just over an hour, the Prime Minister will address the National Press Club on the AUKUS agreement, the security agreement with the UK and the United States announced in the dying days of the Morrison government. Breaking a deal with France to build a new fleet of conventional submarines in order to pursue nuclear-powered submarines via AUKUS was a major part of that announcement, and the strategic implications for Australia's acquisition of a new submarine fleet are massive. The Morrison government's decision has left Australia potentially with a serious capability gap in naval shipbuilding, and to talk us through some of the implications of that, I'm delighted to introduce Glenn Thompson, the Assistant National Secretary of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union. G'day, Glenn.
Hey, Ebony, how are you?
Good, thank you. And Allan Behm, the International and Security Affairs Program Director at the Australia Institute. G'day, Allan.
Good morning, Ebony.
Glenn, I want to start with you first, if I can. Can you just paint us a brief picture of where Australia's naval shipbuilding capability is right at the moment before we get stuck into the details of AUKUS?
So currently, the projections for the naval shipbuilding industry, in our view, there's a capability gap looming as a result of the cancellation of the French contract and the requirements to develop a workforce in advance of AUKUS. We are having a life of type extension on the Collins class submarine, which in our view, based on current projections, will leave a workforce and defence capability gap. We, as the AMW, but also as the Australian Shipbuilding Federation of Unions, which involves the Australian Workers Union, Professionals Australia and the ETU-CPU, have been advocating with support more broadly about the need to build 6 additional new Collins class submarines to build that workforce. We are of the view that if we don't build something, then we are going to have a workforce capability gap to be able to address our naval requirements into the future. Shipbuilding and defence more broadly is important for the Australian economy and for the manufacturing sector, particularly in light of the former government playing that historical role of goading the car industry to leave our shores. Many people that were working in the automotive sector, General Motors Holden, for example, have now transitioned into the naval shipbuilding space, and many of them are playing an incredible role in the work around the design of what we need to do. From our perspective, we see that this gives us an opportunity to rebuild the industrial base, an opportunity to transition workforce knowledge, skills and transfer to deal with the energy transition, electric vehicles, batteries, and advanced technology will be a spin-off out of this process. Before the cancellation of the French contract, we had undertakings from Naval to build a workforce of 5,000 direct people for that project. That would have had spin-offs of around about 2,000 jobs across Western Australia and massive implications in building on the supply chain that's been developed over a long period of time in the shipbuilding programs today. So from our perspective, with what and where we could be waiting with bated breath on the announcement of AUKUS on what is being proposed to fill that gap, to ensure we build a workforce. And from our point of view, we look at sovereign capability, a workforce that has the skills, the knowledge, and the ability to understand technologies to be able to be self-sufficient. So I'll leave my points at that at this point in the conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think we might come back to some of those points that you've raised there, but Allan, Glenn was talking in specifics about kind of the workforce capability that we need. I just wondered if you could jump in and paint us a little bit of a picture about the strategic implications for Australia of AUKUS and the pursuit of nuclear submarines over the conventional French deal that we had.
Well, certainly, Ebony, AUKUS is an odd creature in that it is essentially a press statement. A serious press statement, by the way. I mean, presidents and prime ministers don't just talk for no reason, but there's nothing sort of tangible or enforceable in it except the promise of submarines as one part of it, and then a host of other scientific and cyber-related developments which the three countries were already working on, frankly, and would continue to work on. The key issue here is the decision, which I suspect that the Prime Minister might announce in the next hour or so, that we're going to acquire a nuclear submarine in short order, and then our ability to sustain and deliver that nuclear submarine. Glenn's already touched on the enormous investment that we need to make in a highly skilled, highly capable workforce. And while I can't speak for Glenn's unions, of course, I'm pretty aware that we are pretty undercooked at this point in being able to deliver that. So we've got to move very quickly to do that. And frankly, whether 5,000 people are enough to do this, one might well question. This is a capability, the complexity of which we've never dealt with before. That's not to say that we're going to make mistakes, we certainly will, but it is to say that we're going to need a range of skills that we've actually never envisaged before. And that's just in the industrial workforce. The other side of the skills and workforce equation is, of course, the Navy. We need an entirely different set of skills in the submarine arm of the Navy. And if I can just illustrate that, just to give a taste for it, on the British and American nuclear submarines, there are about 15 people who are qualified at the master's or PhD level in nuclear engineering. We've got none of those in the Navy at this point. And so the investments we need to be able to operate these things safely and with effect are enormous. So there are many things that the Australian government and, of course, more broadly, our business sector are going to have to deal with in short order if we are actually to deliver this capability.
Glenn, coming back to you, what would be the significance of a local shipbuilding project in Australia? You talked about some of the workforce implications there and the jobs, but what does that look like, a local shipbuilding project?
Well, I'll use the example now of the Hunter class project that is going to start cutting steel in the middle of this year. That will have a direct implication of around about 3,800 to 4,200 direct jobs and thousands of jobs within the supply chain.
And sorry, if I can just interrupt, what is the Hunter class? What is
sorry,
that?
the Hunter class is Australia's replacement frigate for the Anzac class frigate, which was built in Australia in Williamstown in Victoria in the early 90s. The Hunter class project is the replacement of that vessel. Over a period of time with the project on the Anzac class build and now moving into the Hunter class build, the Collins class submarine build, we have been able to build a supply chain that delivers 90% of our requirements on the Collins class submarine. If there is not a project that sustains that supply chain and builds on that supply chain to ensure that we are able to address our country's needs, then the real danger is that that supply chain collapses. Companies determine a different approach in relation to what they do. So certainty, and these projects are 3 decades plus, certainty is key here for industry. And of course, certainty is key for workers and students that are currently in school to determine where they wish to go for their future career.
And Glenn, what would be the consequences if the government doesn't commit to a local shipbuilding project like the unions are advocating for here? What happens?
Well, it gives total uncertainty to the existing workforce and the supply chain. One of the things the Australian Shipbuilding Federation of Unions has basically been campaigning for at least a decade over successive governments is these projects have long planning cycles, and industry and workers need certainty in relation to this. So it's really important that we have, and we've been advocating and did have commitments prior to the French contract being cancelled, of a continuous build of submarines and ships to give industry that certainty. We can't have a situation which the SME Association AIDEN pointed out when that French contract was cancelled, where small to medium enterprises basically blew $200 million in preparing for what they thought was a long-term project.
Allan, I wanted to come to you next on, I guess, the submarines themselves and the question that government will be asking itself as it decides how to proceed here. So obviously the Labor government has inherited this decision from the previous one, but what is government considering when it thinks about what our submarine capabilities need to be?
Well, the government is dealing with a very changing circumstance right around the world. We hear a lot about the so-called threat from China, but whatever one thinks about where China sits in the world, there are clearly long-term risks for Australia, which will impact on our defence capabilities in certain circumstances. And it has been part of our strategic thinking in Australia for a long time now that submarines play a critical role in the ability to deliver force at long range. So we need them. Then the question is, well, what sort do you need? And as technology moves on, the argument for nuclear propulsion is actually quite a good argument. Now, look, we all understand what the inhibitions and constraints are, but just as an argument, the issue around staying under the water and being able to move at speed are pretty important issues as this century unfolds. And there's no other propulsion system that can do that. It's not to say that conventional systems won't do the job. They will, and they have in the past. The question is whether nuclear propulsion will do it better. But once you take the decision to go down the nuclear route, then you're opening up a whole series of other issues. And Glenn has just been touching on them very delicately, I might say. But these are enormously complicated systems to build. It's like building a spacecraft of 10,000 tons that's going to go underwater instead of in space. And that's about the complexity of it. You know, he just said, Glenn did, that we're going to have 3,500 working on the FFG replacement. Well, we need more than that just to work on the submarine element of our force. And so we're talking about a very substantial, highly skilled workforce in a population of just over 25 million. A very big ask, and one which the government will have to consider in great depth, because the skills that are required, and look, the AMWU and the ACTU have been drawing attention to this for a quarter of a century now. Every time government makes a very big shipbuilding decision, we carry it through. The moment the project's over, we stop, so that we don't invest in industry, which is just as much a strategic issue as the submarines themselves are. That's the complexity that the government has really got to deal with.
And Allan, if I can just follow up on that, you know, Glenn's been talking about our capabilities with the naval shipbuilding workforce, but there's also been questions raised around Australia's, I guess, what has been termed as sovereign capability when it comes to operating, maintaining the submarine fleet that we end up purchasing. What are some of those considerations when it comes to, I guess, Australia's defence policy?
Yeah. Look, Ebony, sovereignty is a word that's used a lot, but very few people will tell you what they mean by it. Sovereignty is the capacity that a nation has to be able to meet the demands of its own sustenance and sustainment over time, including its defence demands. But in the banking sector, its trade sector, its commercial sector, it has to be able to make decisions which are in the national interest and then execute, carry out those decisions. That's what sovereignty is all about. You don't, I mean, buying in a jet engine is not a derogation of sovereignty. We don't make jet engines in Australia, and frankly, we don't do deep servicing of jet engines anymore. We send them to Singapore or the United States. Does that mean we can't operate Qantas or Jetstar? Well, of course it doesn't. We operate them successfully every day of the week. And that's because there is a difference between sovereignty on the one hand and agency, which is your ability to make decisions and carry them through on the other. In my view, there are not a lot of sovereignty issues actually attaching to the acquisition of the submarine. There are critical decision issues, though, which do attach to that, and all of those have got to be ironed out. So having a submarine with a sealed nuclear reactor that we don't know how to manage, we don't know how to fix if it were to break down, that would require the partner country to actually carry out that work. But does it mean that we can't operate the submarines? Of course it doesn't. But that requires that we have all the skills for the operation of the submarine, that is, the engineers, the people who can run the comm systems, the weapons systems, the fire control systems, all of those things to operate them safely. That's a huge task.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that. So Glenn's obviously talking about the shipbuilding workforce. What does that look like in terms of our defence forces, Allan?
Well, look, at the moment, our defence forces are a bit over 50,000 people altogether. The submarine arms are getting up for 2,000 people. We're talking about a workforce which is over twice the size of the submarine arm itself. I mean, that's what I meant earlier when I said that the industry capability is at least as significant a strategic issue as the submarine operators themselves are. Now, re-equipping our submarine force is going to be an enormous task. Just the other day, Ebony, I was looking up the Navy pennant list. That's what are all of the ships that we've got in the fleet at the moment and who are the captains. And I discovered something pretty alarming. None of our 6 submarines at the moment has a captain. And that suggests to me that at the moment, we're not actually putting our submarines to sea. Now, if we're not doing that, we're starting behind the balk line for all the snooker players. We're starting sort of, in fact, we might be starting off the table, Glenn, if we aren't actually operating our submarines at the moment and keeping the high levels investment in the maintenance, the skill maintenance of our crews. So, Ebony, there are very big questions sitting behind just the question you ask. None of us at the moment have the answers to that, and least of all, I think, the Navy and the government.
Glenn, coming back to you, what are some of the major asks of the Australian Shipbuilding Federation of Unions? What are some of the major asks to government to ensure that we can address this capability gap that you've raised concerns about?
So there's a number of them, Ebony, and it's no surprising one of the key ones is around skills and the importance of unions and industry to be able to work together to identify the issues for the development of the workforce. So we have advocated the ASFU that there needs to be, off the back of these projects in Osborne, the establishment of an engineering centre of excellence, which is not just about building a workforce for the one project, but building a workforce development plan that utilises both the shipbuilding program, the submarine building program or sustainment program, which in turn incorporates supply chain. So that's the first issue. The second issue is being able to address the interoperability of our workforce and portability of our workforce within this particular precinct. And there's a need to have a precinct set of industrial arrangements across the sector to ensure we can shift people with the appropriate skills, the occupational profiles to build capacity, because these projects have peaks and troughs. We don't want to lose the workforce when we have a trough. The third issue is around the issue of a build program to ensure we build a workforce, and how do we best utilise that between the life of type extension and the Hunter class frigate program. How do we build a workforce of at least 3,800 people? Because at present we have 1,200 people working on the life of type extension. And I'll just pick up the point, and I've been watching the webinar chat. We see, based on the timelines and the speculations, without knowing what the AUKUS announcement's going to be, that we need a base of at least 5,000 people to start the project. And currently, I know on the Astute program in the UK, they have a workforce now of 10,000, and they are progressing to build a workforce of up to 17,000. So we see the announcement of AUKUS and whatever comes out of the task force, that the life of type extension and the speculation about exchange programs to change workers as not being significant enough to actually build the base in readiness for whatever the timeline is around a future submarine. And the fourth issue is around how we as Australian unions and industry engage as part of any inter-country secondment around understanding technology and technology transfer, that there needs to be an industry union participation in that program. So they're the four areas that we have been and will continue to advocate with government that we need. The other point is this around the skills and the workforce development. The government has withdrawn funding from the former Naval Shipbuilding College, which was established under the previous government. I saw comments today by the Minister of Industry about how that did not deliver on what it was supposed to do. So the importance and the issue that we raise around the Engineering Centre of Excellence, and if people are interested, they can go to the asfu.org.au website, and there's a copy of the policy document around that particular issue, and including the areas that we've been advocating on the challenges around the capability gap.
We're going to come to questions from the audience very shortly, but Glenn, I did just want to follow up on those kind of major asks to government and just ask you to paint us a picture of the role of our industrial capacity in naval shipbuilding and I guess some of those other businesses in the supply chain that you referred to earlier. How important is this as a component of, I guess, reconstructing Australia's advanced manufacturing sector? You've already kind of, I guess, touched on the point of losing some of that capability when the auto manufacturing closed down. But yeah, what role does naval shipbuilding play in our overall rebuilding of our advanced manufacturing sector?
So in relation to this program of future submarines, we've seen figures that roll from 180 to $250 billion. We don't know if that's around the construction of or the through life sustainment of that one particular project. But what I would say is this, is that once government makes a decision in relation to the direction we go, industry, and when I talk industry, I talk primes and supply chain, need to sit down and have a discussion about how we can work on a collaborative basis. Unfortunately, in Australia, it's a cultural thing, and I hope we can move beyond it. Commercial should be put in the back seat so that we can focus on best interests for country, and that would mean around workforce development, us working together. And the ASFU has been advocating, Ebony, for some time, that once decisions are made on these major projects, then we are of the view that there needs to be an independent statutory authority that manages these projects, a tripartite process with people from industry who understand the complexities of these projects.
And if for people who are interested, I think the Centre for Future Work at the Australia Institute has done some research in the past about the role of manufacturing, and in particular advanced manufacturing, as kind of an engine room of the overall economy when it comes to training, well-paid, secure jobs, and those kinds of elements as well, if we're talking about kind of the bigger economic input of the manufacturing industry. I am going to come to questions from the audience now. And forgive me if I'm not sure who to address these to, because let me confess to the audience, submarine capability is not my area of expertise. So the first question is from Kevin O'Day, and I might send this one to you first, Allan Behm. Barracuda-class submarines in the French Navy are nuclear powered. His question is, what was the problem with making the French submarines program work if we needed nuclear subs?
Well, Kevin, I think that's a really, really good question. And certainly in a paper that the Australia Institute released just the beginning of this week, we've tried to keep the Barracuda on the table, at least for consideration, for a couple of reasons, actually. It's a fine submarine, it works. It uses low enriched uranium for its reactor. Now, while that would require changing over the reactor about 10 or 15 years after it first is brought into use, whereas the British and American reactors last about 30 years, it's a pretty quick changeover. It only takes a couple of weeks. So that, we think, should remain on the table, not least of all because it's about half the size of the Virginia class, a bit bigger than the Collins class at the moment. So, and the number of crew it requires is much less than the other two. So it fits in with some of the workforce things that we were discussing a bit earlier. I think, Ebony, more fundamentally, the French submarine and the French engineering offer would, I suspect, fit our own workforce capacities at this point, at least, a bit better than the other two. And the reason I say that is that the French submarines are modular in their construction. We've been building our surface ships using modular construction. And Glenn, if I make a mistake there, I'm sure you'd quickly correct me.
Yeah.
But we're familiar with that kind of naval architecture and that kind of construction technique. And I suspect we might be a bit faster out of the blocks than having a pair of huge cylinders, a little one and a big one, because they've got their double-hulled vessels, which we then construct in long form rather than in modular form. So there are some reasons that we would want to consider the French Barracuda model, but it does appear at this point that the government is heading down the path of one of the British or American designs. And so the tasks that Glenn is going to have is how to deliver that on the basis of whatever decision the government takes. I think, Ebony, I'll probably have to leave it there because I'm not technically expert enough to advise anybody as to which of the two types we should be going for, that is the low enriched or the high enriched. But it would be an easier safeguards issue for us if we went the low enriched route. There's no doubt about that.
The next question that I've got is from Andrew McMahon, and I think you've made a slight reference to this in saying that you're reading some of the comments in the chat there, Glenn. Andrew says, patently headhunting for nuclear qualified naval personnel from the US Navy and Royal Navy will be needed to create a competent core of capable engineering staff in addition to the shore-based people. I'm wondering if you could just reflect on that balance of building the capability here versus having to recruit people from overseas to expand that workforce, Glenn.
Yeah, so I'll couch it in this way. When we had certainty around a French diesel electric Barracuda submarine and the Hunter class vessel, we were working with industry, the primes, particularly around this question in respect to what we need to do to develop the workforce and how we can work collaboratively to ensure that we're not poaching skilled workers from each project. So we think that it is absolutely crucial as an industry that we identify, and hence I raised the issue about the proposition that we're proposing for the Engineering Centre of Excellence. We need to identify the occupations and the skills that are required to build whatever we're going to build. We need to identify those occupational profiles against skills and jobs within the Australian economy now. We need to identify the gaps required to address those issues so we can build broader capacity. And we need to have a process of forward thinking of what is coming down the pipeline, because the reality is, picking up on Alan's point, yes, we build modular stuff, and including Collins class and the French diesel electric Barracuda was modular classed. All of those are now moving to digital twinning models, including different skills for what traditional, for example, boilermakers, welders, electricians, pipe fitters, etc., would have previously done. So it is a fact, and there is talk that there's graduates already in the US and the UK. There is projects on foot. We have to build our own capacity. I think the important point to make here is both the US and the UK projects are under extensive pressure. They have workforce and skills issues that they themselves are addressing. So it's going to be a pertinent point for whatever comes out of the AUKUS decision, that there is coordination and collaboration. And from the ASFU's perspective, we have already started to engage with our US and UK union colleagues around these challenges for our respective constituents.
Just a reminder, you can type your questions for our panel into the Q&A box. We've got a few hundred people on the line with us today, so thank you for all of your questions. Allan, I might flip that one to you to talk about, I think the original questioner was also asking about the onboard personnel for submarines as well. I'm not sure how that works in the Defence Force, but and there's another question from Jennifer Manson here about how is the Navy going to staff these submarines when we appear to struggle to staff the smaller ones that we have in operation now. Do we have agreements with the UK and the United States that we might be able to poach personnel from there? How does that work? What does that workforce problem look like for the armed forces?
Well, Ebony, there are quite a number of dimensions of that question. Australia and the United States and Britain, just those three, but I mean Canada and New Zealand and a few others as well. We've had exchange officer arrangements for very, very many decades now. And at any one time, we'll have our officers operating with their services and their officers operating with ours across the whole spectrum of defence systems in each of the services and defence capabilities. So that's a well-trodden path, and I would expect that that would continue, probably with a bit of expansion. We also, over a very long period of time, have been recruiting from foreign navies, particularly from the Royal Navy, because the alignments between the Royal Australian Navy and the Royal Navy are very, very long in history. We have very similar operating cultures, and indeed, some of our very senior commanders in the Royal Australian Navy have actually been people who were hired from the Royal Navy, including in our submarine domain. So I think we will continue to do that, and we'll probably need to be a bit more aggressive in hiring people who might have reached the end of their career service in the Royal Navy or the US Navy to come in and work with ours. That I think would be a logical thing to do. I think also we will be looking to expanding the training that we offer to our own naval personnel abroad. And that's the point that Jennifer makes in her question about when we acquired the Oberon class. The decisions for that were made in the 1960s. We were going to get 8 of them, but we ended up with 6. And when we're on the point of actually getting the first ones, we actually sent the crews and their families to Britain to undertake a lengthy period of training to operate them. And so I expect that we're going to have to do the same thing again if we were to acquire a British or an American boat, or even a French one for that matter, though I suspect that's off the table. So I think that your question sort of gets back into the broad issue of workforce planning, workforce design, and all of the training that's got to be put into that. And I might just put a bow around my answer, Ebony, by saying, when people from the Royal Australian Navy come to the end of their careers, they very often move off into industry itself. So that the people that Glenn would have been talking to, more particularly, I think, from the primes, but some, I suspect, in his own workforce, will be people who have been trained either as apprentices in the Royal Australian Navy or trained in systems management if they were amongst the naval officers. So a lot of those people, we will need them to continue on their working lives for quite a long time, I suspect, to make sure that we have some of the high-level management and technical skills without which programs like this ultimately will fail.
Glenn, the next question is for you from John Baker, and you may not be able to answer it, I'm not sure, but he's just asking what, if any, consultation has there been with your collection of unions leading up to today's announcements and decisions that we're expecting?
So the Shipbuilding Federation of Unions has had regular engagement with the political process for the last decade. And we will continue to do so. The asks that I just stepped through, we're only recently advocating those with government, and we will continue to do so. the Australian unions meet regularly to discuss our approach collectively on these. And as I indicated, only this morning I was we're not only dealing with it in Australia, but we're dealing with it internationally, and have been particularly on the shipbuilding program for at least 5 years, well before the current projects had been announced.
Allan, coming to you, this is more of a political question. Ronald Smith has asked, if the Republicans get back into the White House, can they pull the plug on our submarines as we did to the French?
Well, I suppose technically, Ebony, they could. Presidents in the United States clearly have a huge amount of power. We could sort of play that question back the other way. Had Trump really won the 2019 election, would he have come to the decision that President Biden did in announcing AUKUS? I just leave that as a floating question. I suspect not. But I don't think that the United States actually plays its hand that way. In my experience of working with the United States over a very long period of time, when the US comes to a decision on a matter as critical as this, with all of the factors that have been taken into account through the Pentagon, through US industry, the consultation with the major US primes in the sort of defence industry sector in the United States, which is huge, I think we would not expect the United States to undo the deal. The United States will always put its own interests first. And as Glenn said earlier, we know already that the demands of the construction of both the Virginia and the Ohio, the New Columbia class, are putting enormous burdens on the two major submarine production facilities in the US. So if we do go down the US route, then that will be difficult to deliver. But if the United States agrees to deliver it, then I'm pretty confident that the United States will meet the agreement. We should remember, of course, that on a matter like immigration, the Turnbull government had an agreement with the Obama presidency, which I think reluctantly, but nonetheless, genuinely, President Trump did honour. So I suspect that with submarines, we would find a similar pattern of reluctant agreement, perhaps, but agreement and honouring the agreement nonetheless.
And Allan, sticking with you, I've got a question from Bernie Mac here, asking a question about what ultimately Australia needs these submarines for. So I guess he's asking, does the Bass Strait need nuclear submarines? What is the kind of aim of having them, and has that shifted at all with the AUKUS agreement compared to what we had previously with France?
No, I don't think that the strategic principles underpinning the need for a submarine capability have changed. It has long been the fundamental approach to Australian defence policy, and this goes back to the 80s, when Kim Beazley actually conducted the big DIB review, that the focus of Australian defence is on the maritime approaches to Australia, which, except for the bluefins and the minkies, is not Bass Strait. The maritime approaches are really through the northeastern and northwestern approaches to Australia, and of course across the Arafura Sea. So what submarines do is give you a highly mobile and very difficult to detect capacity to interdict any maritime forces, or mainly sea forces, that are seeking to come across those waters. In addition to that, submarines can operate at very long range, so that if it were to be a strategic choice by an Australian government to operate our submarines further beyond the immediate maritime approaches, and by that I mean north of the equator, then submarines are really good at that. You need a lot of submarines to do it really effectively, but nonetheless, a dozen or so submarines would give you a capacity to do that. And that has remained as part of our strategic planning, as I say, for a very long time now. I mentioned earlier that the one additional advantage that the nuclear propulsion would give submarines is that we're able to deploy further away from Australia much, much more quickly and with much lower chances of being detected. And they would be attractive options, I think, for any force planner. And certainly, if I was still in the business of offering advice to government professionally, I would be probably making a pretty strong argument in that direction.
The next question I've got is from John Beswick, and I might send this one to you, Glenn. He's commenting that submarines need basing and that the 3 suggested bases are Brisbane, Newcastle and Wollongong, all 3 being major population centres. His question is, does this require rethinking? But I guess my additional question to you, building on that, is are those bases kind of in proximity to where our naval shipbuilding capability is at the moment, and do they need to be close together or not?
So from under the previous government, there was a review done by RAND Corporation, which is an American think tank, to look at this whole question in relation to location of Australian shipbuilding yards, because previously, if I take the Hobart class destroyer, which is most recently built, it was built in modular construction utilising Williamstown in Victoria, Forjacks in Newcastle, and Osborne in Adelaide, where it was finally consolidated and commissioned into a ship. At present, the majority of Australia's naval basing is either on the west coast over at Garden Island in Henderson, or on the east coast at Garden Island in New South Wales. In relation to the basing, and I will assume, based on, and I don't know, I haven't any detail on this, but based on the speculation and that in the reporting, I would suspect that AUKUS will make an announcement in relation to the basing question. But what I would suggest, that this issue about another base on north or east, etc., has been on the table for a decade and a half, and I would suggest that more would be probably said in the Defence Strategic Review announcement by government. And as you indicated, Ebony, at the outset, the Prime Minister will be touching on that at the Press Club today, and I would assume that deals with more than submarines and maritime. That deals with Australia's future positioning across all domains of our defence.
I've got another couple of questions that really relate to why we need submarines, Allan. So people asking how much does this tie us into the United States military strategy and operations, asking is forward defence an oxymoron? Surely our big question should be, should our central defence strategy be to make a small contribution to the American project or defence of our own country? I just wonder if you could comment a little bit more on some of those considerations.
Yeah, this is a hugely big issue, Ebony, of course, and I'm sure the questioner understands that as well as I do.
I've cobbled together a few different questions there.
Let's start at the beginning. The binary way of thinking about national defence doesn't work. The defence of Australia and forward defence, they're not alternatives. Forward defence as a way of not having defence assets in Australia, that was seen to be a deficient way of trying to do it. But these days, we've got plenty of defence capability in Australia, which is designed both to defend Australia immediately from attack, but also to be able to defend and promote our national strategic interests where and when the government decides it wants to do that. Sometimes that will be in partnership with the United States. On other occasions, it may well be that we have to act independently in our own interest. Just depends on the circumstances. Importantly, though, we have to have the capability to do the latter. We have to be able to operate independently, and we can't just make assumptions that because we got F-35s from the United States, in partnership with a whole lot of other countries, of course, that we could only operate them along with the United States. Similarly, with our new Hobart class and the upcoming FFGs that we're going to get, we'll be able to operate those interoperably with the US or with Britain or with a number of other navies, but we will operate them in our own interest. So coming then specifically to a British or an American submarine, the acquisition of either the Astute or the Virginia class doesn't lock us in to British or American strategic policy. What it does do is make us reliant on British design and build, and it makes us reliant on, alternatively, American design or build. And in that, we would want to partner, we want to be fully engaged, and yet be able to operate them ourselves. That's what I meant much earlier when I said that we've got to retain agency to decide if and when we use them, on what terms and conditions we use them. And I can't see any Australian government, whether it's a Labor government or a coalition government, wanting to make Australia simply a kind of total servant to the United States and its interest. I think that that is not what any Australian government has in mind. What they do appear to have in mind is that there would be a reasonably high probability that we would join with the Americans in a number of different sorts of scenarios. I suspect over time, the complications attaching to those scenarios will cause us to think all of those things through and to think very carefully about what Australian interests are actually being achieved in any military operation with a major partner or any other partner. I'm sorry that's a fairly vague answer, but I mean, governments have got to keep things open and keep flexible, but I don't myself see that we are inevitably locked in to American deployments simply because we might buy an American submarine any more than we are inevitably locked in to British deployments if we buy a British submarine. I think that governments will fight to retain their own agency.
Glenn, it's my understanding you have a rally coming up in Adelaide soon.
Yeah, we do. So as part of the ASFU's campaign around ensuring that we build something to build a workforce in Adelaide, we will be having a rally this Friday, the 24th at 12 p.m. SA time at the top end of Victoria Square. This is part of our campaign to ensure we address the issues of concern that we've been campaigning for years, and that we deliver on the asks that we've put in discussions with government.
Thank you. And Allan, one last question to you from Gavin Miller, who says, strategically, why do we need crewed submarines, let alone nuclear powered? And he talks about Malcolm Turnbull intimating that autonomous underwater craft could make crewed submarines obsolete. Do you have any comment on that before we finish up?
There are a lot of issues buried in that question, Ebony. The main reason that you want to keep human beings in the loop for as long as you possibly can in the deployment of defence systems is that you have to be able to turn them off. You have to have decision makers in the loop, and that is why we still fly what we beautifully call inhabited aircraft, and we still sail inhabited ships. Of course, technology will give us a host of new options, and they will be pilotless aircraft and unmanned underwater vehicles. That inevitably will happen. But the use of the human brain to take critical decisions, particularly in the trickiest of circumstances, we can't yet just allow AI to make all of those decisions for us. So I think we will probably transition over time to a much greater reliance on uninhabited vessels. But in the meantime, we've got to get there. And so an acquisition of a new submarine, which will take us out into somewhere around about the 2070s, is, I think, a strategic imperative. And at the same time, we've got to begin our thinking and planning and designing now for where we're going to go after that. So it's a question of looking at keeping a whole lot of balls in the air and looking forward quite a long way while we take much shorter term decisions.
And any final observations from you, Glenn Thompson?
Only to say that we actually have to build something to build the workforce. And if we don't build something, we won't have a workforce. And that's going to have major implications in our view on the issue around self-reliance and sustainability. But I go back to the point that I made in my opening, that we have an opportunity here to use these projects to develop transfer of technology and knowledge into other areas that we're facing in our economy, particularly around the transition from energy to batteries, to wind, to solar. There's a whole lot of technologies within this space with the right policy in place that are transferable to start to build what the Prime Minister has said, that he wants Australia to be a country that makes things.
Excellent. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much to Glenn Thompson and Allan Behm. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions. If you enjoyed today's webinar and would like to see more, please consider supporting our work with a tax-deductible gift today. Every little bit helps. You can do that at australiainstitute.org.au. Don't forget to subscribe to australiainstitute.tv on YouTube and to our podcast, Follow the Money. And you can join us next Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. for the next in our Nordic Talks webinar series. We're going to be chatting to Dr. Sandro Di Maio, CEO of Vic Health, who's an experienced researcher in the Nordic nations, and Marianne Weinreich, the chair and co-founder of the Cycling Embassy of Denmark, about how to make Australian cities more livable and people-friendly. That's next Wednesday at 6 p.m. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. As always, sorry that we can't get to all of them. And thank you again to Glenn and Allan. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.